Theos and Sheen watched from a distance as the apex predators descended upon the desert. Theos held tight to Sententia's sword. Though the blade was slender and light for a man, it took all the strength the little fox had to hold it up. "Theos, give me the sword. Let me face them," Sheen said, watching Theos's arms shake beneath the blade's weight. Sheen thought once more of rushing the boy and taking the sword. But now Theos's anger was almost tangible, and moreover he held the power of creation in his hands. Whatever feeling of helplessness Sheen had felt when Zion walked up the temple stairs the first time, that feeling was tenfold now. Even if he did manage to disarm Theos, he would have to then turn and deal with the oncoming horde. Theos was not sure what to do next, so he did as he had seen his father do 100 times before. He turned the blade over in his hands and thrust it into the ground. He felt a wave of heat wash over him. Was this a surge of power from the sword? It felt like he was holding the sun itself. He could hear so many voices. Were these the people around him? He could feel the wind. No, more than that, he could control it. Shanks, the proud Griffin general, and a hardened soldier of Haven's army, stopped now and stood on the desert sand. It was his custom, being a creature of flight, to land at least once upon the ground he and his men would conquer. An army of griffins and Pegasus, 200 strong, followed him into battle. Their wings beat like thunder as they crossed the canyon to the desert sand. The sun was high in the sky as a sandstorm began to gather in the distance. Shanks decided to lead his men over the top of the storm. After all, griffins and Pegasus regularly flew through strong gales, so he saw no reason to stop. It was not until they reached the top of the swirling sandstorm that the muffled screams began, barely audible over the howling wind. The proud feathers began to be pulled into the sandstorm one by one as the storm intensified. Shanks took to the ground for a moment and shielded himself with his wings until the storm began to subside. Then as the storm let up, Shanks dropped his wings to find himself alone. Men report. He yelled as he tried to pull himself up out of the sand. To his surprise, the sand began to pull back, holding his legs and lunging up to grab his wings. As Shanks struggled against the sand, Theos began walking toward him, growling with Sheen at his side. "Who are you, little beast? Where are my men?" Shanks demanded. Theos waved his hand, and the sand all around Shanks blew back to reveal the bloody, mangled corpses of the 200 who had followed Shanks into battle. They had been filled with and ripped apart by the sand that would serve as their final tomb. For the first time, terror found its way into the heart of the proud Griffin as his struggle against the sand intensified, and Theos continued his advance. Theos stood just out of arm's reach of Shanks, now glaring at his trembling soul. "The full army of Haven will storm this desert. The sky will fall, and the sand will run red with the blood of you beasts," Shanks shouted. "The sky has already fallen, and the sand is already red with the blood of your men," Theos replied as the sand began to pull at Shanks' wings. "But not you. No, you go. Run as fast as you can. And tell your king the demon of the sand is coming, and he will spare no man, woman, or child. Tell him the sands of wrath will wash over your kingdom like a tidal wave. Tell him, just as you have told me, that the sky will fall, the sand will run red with blood, and the very existence of Haven will be buried, lost to all history." "The Flame King," Shanks began to retort, but Theos flexed his hand, and Shanks could feel the bones pop in his back and chest. "I will personally extinguish his flames," Theos replied as he reveled in the pain and fear he saw in the proud Griffin's eyes. "Theos, that is enough," Sheen balked as Shanks began to scream in pain. "I want to hear him beg for mercy," Theos replied, not taking his eyes off the flailing man. "Please, stop. Mercy, mercy," Shanks yelled as tears came to his eyes. The sand stopped as Theos leaned into his face and whispered, "No." Theos closed his hand, and Shanks' wings were ripped off by the sand, breaking his shoulder blades in the process. Shanks screamed in pain as tears began to stream down his face, and blood began flowing freely from his back. "Now go, and if you ever return to this desert, I will make sure your death is more slow and painful than you could ever imagine." Shanks blacked out from the pain. Theos stood shaking now, Sententia's sword still gripped in his right hand, with the blade itself resting on the sand. "Theos," Sheen stammered. "Theos, give me the sword." Theos tossed the sword to the side, and as it left his hand it turned to sand and blew away in the wind. Sheen watched as the final grains blew away. "No one should wield that sword," Theos replied. It was 2 weeks before Shanks made it back to Haven. He had almost bled to death before he could find aid in the Haven countryside. After being patched up and resting for several days in a small border town, he made his way back to the castle to warn King Midas. "Shanks, what have they done to you?" King Midas exclaimed as Shanks entered the courtroom with his head hung in shame. "Your Majesty, the God King lives. He's a monster that controls the entire desert. He said he is coming for Haven, and no one will be spared. Fetch me the spider-wretch Arenia," Midas commanded. "Your Majesty," Arenia said as she came into King Midas's court and gave a low bow. "You said the King of the Sand was dead," Midas said as his flames intensified, almost burning Arenia's flesh and causing the guards around him to slightly distance themselves. "He is, sire," Arenia replied. "One of his sons must have survived. A child threatens my kingdom." Midas squawked as he turned back to Shanks. "A child that wields the desert and backed by a united army of wild beasts," Shanks replied. "You yielded to the anger of a child and have the audacity to return here and face me," Midas yelled. "Please, my lord, cast the forbidden spell of the Phoenix," Arenia begged, "so that we may all share in your immortality." Midas stopped now and turned to glare at Arenia. "How do you know of that spell?" he asked, now questioning Arenia's motives. Had immortality been her goal all along? "There is a reason that spell is forbidden. Though we enjoy longevity, nothing should live forever. Not even us, my king." The boy said he would spare no one. Shanks pleaded. "He will commit the dragon's sin." "Do we fear the dragons?" Midas asked as he looked disgusted by Shanks' broken form. "No," Shanks said as he turned his gaze away. "Though our tamelings may perish, our kingdom is eternal, and it will endure." "Shanks, if you have been burdened with the fear of your mortality, you should not have returned. It would have been better for you to have laid down and waited to share the fate of your men than to come and face me in such disgrace," Midas said. "Are you willing to bet your daughter's life on that?" Arenia asked. Midas was furious, now angered by the suggestion. And as he stood to turn Arenia to ashes, Shanks made a lunge for him and grabbed his arm, pulling his feathers off and burning his hand in the attempt. "Nova Vida Eternum," Shanks began as he tried to cast the spell himself using the power of Midas' feathers, but Keith, a Pegasus and the king's guard, smashed him in the mouth with the hilt of his sword, sending teeth sliding across the floor and causing Shanks to stumble backwards. Midas threw a fireball and beamed Shanks in the back as he tried to get back on his feet. "Shanks, how dare you betray your king?" Midas squawked. "You would let your people perish rather than use your magic. What is the point of having all that power if you will not use it?" Shanks screamed back as Keith drew his sword and came for him. As the court's attention was turned to the clash between the Griffin and the Pegasus, Arenia saw the opportunity she had been looking for as the gust of their wings blew another one of Midas' feathers to her. She quietly dropped a thread from one of her slender fingers, picking the feather up with her silk, and began rubbing it in her palms, chanting as it turned from a warm glowing feather to grey ash. "Agatha, cast your shadow upon us. Let your darkness hide us from time's light, and fill our lives with everlasting night. Strip their flesh from their bones so their lands they may forever own. Save us from the dragon's wrath, free from death's eternal grasp." Midas turned his attention back to her, realizing what she had done, and began to throw another fireball, intending to kill her with it. The fireball formed but dissipated into nothing as it left his fingertips. "What have you done, wretch?" Midas demanded as the light of his flaming feathers surged and immediately began to fade, and flesh began to fall from his fingers. "I have granted you eternal life," Arrhenius snickered as the flesh from Shang's jaw made a sickening thud on the ground, and spiders began to sail down from the heights of the courtroom on threads of silk. Your people will live as eternal servants to the Spider Clan. Slaves to the darkness lest the sun bleach your bones and turn them to dust. That day Haven fell to the Spider Queen, and the first of the two great Apex clans was humbled.